Alright, today's video is one I've been excited to make for quite a while, and also one I've been slowly building towards in order to produce the best version possible. The topic I want to cover is the complete history and explained evolution of microtransactions in gaming, and outline how current pricing is based upon a consumer fallacy that has been manipulated beneath the surface to maximize profit at the expense of user experience. To begin, we must journey back a number of years. For the sake of not stretching this video into a multi-hour analysis, the starting point will be the early days of the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. I sometimes lose track and think to myself how recent that was. I can clearly remember playing games like Oblivion or Gears of War around that period, and it's hard to grasp sometimes that over a decade has gone by, and the landscape has shifted in a titanic way. The most important factor at that point in history is the shift towards standardized $60 releases. Now, for the sake of total transparency, I'm not sure at what date exactly the practice of pretty much every new major title costing $60 became fully established, but right around or soon after the launch of the PlayStation 3 in 2006, and a year or so after the release of the Xbox 360, which occurred in 2005, typical AAA video games became widely priced at $60. It was also at this point that we got our first taste of microtransactions, and that is the starting point for the purposes of this video. To be clear, microtransactions in various capacities have existed in Eastern markets for many years, but my focus today is more on the Western gaming industry, and thus I did not specifically look into early examples of microtransactions in the Chinese or Korean markets. But without further ado, let's truly get started. The year is 2006, the standard price of top-level video games is now $60, and things seem to be stable and predictable. Enter Bethesda. Now, Bethesda was not alone. A year or so ago, Microsoft, in advance of the Xbox 360 actually releasing, had advertised the concept of microtransactions as not only an alternative revenue stream for publishers, but also as a benefit to players by allowing them to buy smaller items at will without paying as much. Bethesda took the initiative and really brought the concept to the mainstream spotlight in their Elder Scrolls title, Oblivion. The milestone here is the horse armor. I've mentioned it in videos before and made jokes about how what began then is now a step up from modern day practices, but it's time to really examine that claim. The concept of DLC already existed, but horse armor in Oblivion was the offering of simple horse cosmetics for $2.50. A micro DLC, if you will, or microtransaction. Players hated this. The horse armor was met with near instant and overwhelmingly negative backlash, but despite the public outcry, as far as I've been able to tell or find, the sales for both the horse armor and other microtransaction items that Bethesda sold at that time were high enough that it was deemed an overall success. Keep in mind that this is 2006, this was a full-priced game from a major publisher that was also monetizing further with microtransactions. The door was open, and from then on, microtransactions invaded the world of Western gaming. There are too many titles to even list that began to add in armor, weapons, areas, cosmetics, you name it, all under this newfound framework that gamers were quite vocally against, but still buying into. The next real milestone to cover is online passes. Now that microtransactions were established as an industry practice, though far from present in every single release, they appeared to be here to stay. So what's next? Well, next is the online pass. Different than a season pass, the online pass was a code given in the launch edition of new titles that would allow users to actually play the games that featured an online component. The idea was simple: harvest additional profits from the used games market. What were once standard features available to everyone who purchased the game were now paid services that required a one-time use code available for a preset amount of money. For today, we will focus on EA for this topic, though there are additional examples of online passes. EA implemented the online pass primarily into their sports franchises, which heavily feature online play, and as a result, they effectively raised the price of their games from an industry standard $60 to $60 plus the $10 for an online passcode. The online pass was met, much like the horse armor, with immediate and severe backlash. The practice of chopping out content once offered for all players and selling it back with single-use codes just to access features players were already used to and expecting was obviously not going to be received well, and it was in fact so controversial and damaging to their audience that EA reversed the decision a few years later and scrapped the concept of online passes. EA passed the decision off as them listening to the fans, which it might very well have been, I guess, but there were also several speculations that upcoming DRM, or digital rights management changes on the part of Microsoft, were going to greatly impact them, and the change was less a function of fan backlash and more a result of changing corporate framework. Either way, online passes were over right around 2013, and they were fully abandoned. Now, during all of this, and within several other companies, the Season Pass was taking shape. The idea behind the Season Pass was that it could bundle a large batch of content together, which players were highly unlikely to even purchase half of, sell it at a discount, and thus lock in larger profits from more customers who otherwise would have purchased less on average. The problem with season passes, though, is that more often than not, players are committing to the purchase of content that doesn't yet exist and has no real description or explanation. So at launch, alongside a $60 game, players were also being sold a $20, $30, even $50 season pass, which would entitle them to a full year's worth of DLC, but had no idea what that DLC would actually be. Furthermore, nearly all of those players would not have ended up purchasing most of the DLC anyways, after it was fully revealed or created months later, so they were paying more for less as a result of clever new monetization tactics. The Season Pass, unlike the Online Pass, became mainstream very quickly and persists to this very day. It can be seen in sports franchises, Call of Duty, even single-player RPGs, and even now the same problem can be seen where a price is set for content that has yet to exist, and there is no guarantee it will even be worth a shred of the original price tag. A third occurrence around this time period, specifically 2010 to 2013, was the introduction of an even more insidious concept: loot boxes. Now, loot boxes have existed in Eastern markets since long before this, but again, I'm focusing on the Western mainstream games industry. They have also existed on various social media platform games, like those of Facebook, for instance. But 2010 saw the first implementation within true PC or console game titles: Valve with Team Fortress 2, and EA with FIFA Ultimate Team. Loot boxes were an evolution on the basic microtransaction, where once players had known exactly what they would get and made a conscious decision to either purchase or pass, loot boxes shrouded the rewards in randomized containers, which enabled companies to extract larger sums of money for less desirable rewards. An added side effect is that loot boxes are gambling. There is no equivocating around this fact, though companies have largely been successfully avoiding legislation up till very recently. Loot boxes are gambling. It's an objective fact. So microtransactions were no longer just simple items for smaller price tags. They now incorporated a predatory tactic on par with a digital casino, but with less oversight. Now we must jump forward a number of years to 2017. During the span from 2011 to 2017, microtransactions became more prominent, especially in online shared world titles. Season passes expanded to include more franchises, most notably the annualized games like Assassin's Creed, for example, and loot boxes were spreading like a plague as well, through popular titles like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO, which released in 2012 and gave birth to an entire economy of skin gambling, loot box purchases, and peer-to-peer bets over the outcome of various competitions or matches. In 2017, though, we get our next major milestones, and those are Shadow of War and Star Wars Battlefront 2. Shadow of War was a single-player title, now online only, but that's an entirely separate issue, that opted to allow for a full suite of microtransactions, and not only that, but loot boxes which featured orc captains as the reward. This was immediately met with backlash, but it didn't stop there. Shadow of War was also introducing a section of story called the Shadow Wars, which was extremely transparent in its goal of incentivizing the purchase of microtransactions and loot boxes in order to get past a lengthy grind, which locked away the final story climax behind hours and hours of tedious grinding and work. This was not only the introduction of microtransactions into a mainstream single-player game, but also a clear instance where those microtransactions had caused the developers to alter gameplay as a tactic to spur user spending. While the game was met with fairly high praise overall, the new step forward in the realm of monetization could not be ignored, and many players began to realize that this was an ever-creeping progression. Later in 2017, only a few months after, in fact, the largest milestone for our entire timeline hits, and that's Star Wars Battlefront 2, from, you guessed it, EA again. Star Wars Battlefront 2 took the concept of loot boxes, which were by now an entrenched standard for FIFA in the form of its Ultimate Team packs, and turned it into the core progression for the entire Star Wars Battlefront 2 game. The entire title was constructed as a funnel to push players into purchasing crates, and the crates had randomized rewards which helped squeeze the maximum amount out of the audience that they possibly could. Star cards were shown on death as a psychological manipulation tactic to try and spur further purchases. Arcade mode would lock players out after a set time frame. The whole game was one giant middle finger of greed. Reddit users did the math, exposing that it would take dozens of hours just to unlock beloved characters like Darth Vader, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 became the iconic catastrophe that defined EA, loot boxes, and even modern AAA gaming. As a result of EA bastardizing a beloved childhood franchise, the world turned its head. Governmental bodies began to regulate loot boxes, the effects of which are still rolling forward, and massive sections of the consumer industry adopted a decidedly hostile stance moving forward. Now we move forward yet again to the end of 2018 and the release of Fallout 76. We've come full circle now, back to Bethesda. Fallout 76 introduced a microtransaction shop called the Atomic Shop, which was effectively the only working portion out of their entire defective product. There were very clear commitments made that the shop would never hold anything other than cosmetic items, but lo and behold, a few months later, they have introduced repair kits, which allow for the repair of in-game items and undeniably impact gameplay. They also nerfed various perk cards alongside that to reduce the mitigation aimed at increasing item durability, and the end result is that they blatantly lied to their customers. If we juxtapose the start and the end of our timeline, because that is the end for the purposes of this video with Fallout 76, a serious problem becomes visible. Around 2006 and during the heyday of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, games became standardized around a $60 price tag. At that time, microtransactions in the Western market really didn't exist, at least not in any sort of mainstream way. Over the course of about 12 years, microtransactions began, evolved, morphed, and ballooned out to a now unbelievable extreme. Companies made a pass at one-time use codes to try and eliminate or at least capitalize on the secondhand game markets. They also began to pre-package and sell content that does not exist yet as a tactic to further increase per-user spending. They introduced literal gambling and then modified progression of even single-player games around that gambling to again spike profits at the expense of customer experience. And all of this makes no mention of the ridiculous pre-order bundles, which package and sell demo or beta offerings at the expense of product quality. The games industry has rapidly undergone a metamorphosis of sorts, but instead of a beautiful butterfly, it is an ugly, demented creature that preys on anything that comes too close. Right alongside all of the customer woes, we can see crunch time culture not only embraced, but dressed up as a positive and called things like BioWare magic. Developers are having nervous breakdowns at a lot of these different studios. It's terrible. There are new titans in the industry like Epic Games that sees management calling contractors bodies and literally referring to them as disposable. On multiple levels for both the developer and customer, the industry has degraded. Now I want to discuss the main counter-argument I hear when discussing the topic of microtransactions. Games need microtransactions. You don't know about inflation. Games cost $60 and they have for so long. They should be $80 or more. We're lucky to have microtransactions. Stop complaining. This is the battle cry of the mentally deficient. The standardized pricing model was established around 2006 for $60, but the defense of inflation only works with a linear development cost model, which is anything but true for the games industry. If we use a US inflation calculator based on historic inflation standards, we can see that a $60 game in 2006 costed roughly $75 today. Seems like a win for my opponents, does it not? Wrong. If everything within the industry remained unchanged, yes, it would hold up. But the truth is that the cost to make a video game, specifically for major publishers, have, in a relative sense, been steadily decreasing. The first major change is the rise of digital sales. Games now sell with overwhelming majority through digital storefronts. Eliminating the cost of physical manufacturing is no small thing. Not only does a company cut down on manufacturing costs, but they now exclude transportation and perhaps multiple retail partners. Another angle to consider is that almost all major publishers now offer proprietary digital storefronts themselves, Origin, Uplay, Bethesda Launcher, etc., which means direct-to-consumer sales which allow for total profit retention. On top of this, many game publishers now use proprietary game development engines. Game engines are highly expensive, and in the past, most games were developed after securing the rights to use various engines that publishers did not directly control. Now, however, companies like EA use Frostbite, their own property, which means yet again a reduction in development costs. Bethesda uses the creation engine based on the Gamebryo engine, and in that instance, we can see that much of the material is simply copy-pasted from previous titles. In Fallout 76, there are mass sections of code that are totally unchanged since Skyrim and Fallout 4. Not to mention much of their major improvements, if you can even call them major, came from their modding community. Yet again, a reduction in development cost. And lastly, also most importantly probably, the profitability of typical AAA games has been increasing year over year like clockwork. A lot of factors go into this: an expansion on available demographics, increased marketing budgets, many things. But the biggest factor is the massive increase to monetization. In 2006, a $60 game would cost $60. Nowadays, that's worth about $75. But over time, where once a $60 game was that, and only that, games now have massive digital deluxe editions designed to play on user fear of missing out, selling beta access, demo access, or blatant unwiped early access. These editions often cost $80 or even $100, and they come with some plastic gimmicks or a map, sure, but those are unbelievably cheap to manufacture. A game like Anthem sold an $80 version with a lousy set of digital cosmetics. That's it. So when a user purchases one of these pre-order packages, they are already paying more than the conversion price of a 2006 industry standard $60 game. Let's go further. Season passes are now more mainstream than ever and range in price from around $20 to $50. Let's say $35, that seems to be pretty common. That takes a $60 game for many users and often turns it into a $95 title. Then you can factor in the microtransactions themselves with all the bonus incentives, the throttled experience or progression. That yet again raises the average price that users are paying. Many players will claim, but I don't buy that stuff, so it's not true. Fine, you don't buy it, but many people do. And because they buy it, the average per user profit rises from $60 to much, much higher than that. Then we get into the whole topic of gambling addiction and the mass amounts of money that susceptible personalities will pay when exposed to this blatantly malicious tactic. Again, lots of players don't engage, but many do, and this pulls the net average of per player earnings even higher. As the percentage of profit that publishers keep progressively increases, the per user profit amounts rise just as fast. When a game used to cost $60 flat and a publisher would keep, let's say, for the sake of example, 40 of that $60 overall, games might now, on average, net $100 per user, and publishers keep 90 of it. The exact specifics are not possible to extrapolate without massive levels of insider access, but the truth of the matter is that games are earning more money than they ever have been by colossal levels, and yet somehow ignorant apologists still defend the inclusion of predatory tactics as if they are necessary. In 12 years, we went from nothing to skirting gambling laws in order to get children to buy loot boxes, from a flat finished product to a funnel with throttled earnings and segments to push you into spending more to fix the artificially created problems, and from a landscape where quality or polish were emphasized to one where marketing and flashy gimmicks are mainstream with the underlying goal of seeing how far the line can be pushed. People whine, bitch, and complain that I'm too negative. I have to believe it's mostly children that do that. I was alive to remember gaming in the early 2000s. Yes, the graphics were worse. Yes, there were still bad game releases and crappy products, but having witnessed the entire timeline and remembering it as well, I wasn't in diapers, it's clear to me, and I hope to everyone, that the industry is on a downward trajectory. Amazing titles certainly exist, there are plenty of them, and they should be rewarded, but the idea that we have not entered into a tug-of-war relationship with the bulk of currently mainstream publishers is naive, and they pull very hard. That's it though. Hopefully this video has been interesting. I wanted to lay out from start to finish the tale of microtransactions in modern Western video games and talk about the fallacy of current game pricing because so many people have become complacent with the ill-founded notion that they don't need to worry since the industry has their best interests at heart. It doesn't, and it hasn't for a very long time. If you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. We have a simple Patreon or channel memberships or merch or whatever else, but by watching this far, you've already supported more than enough, so I won't drag it out any further. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.